Welcome to the second installment of CarFling Asks. So today I've got William Miller, the CEO of Dealers Online, and we're going to tackle the evolution of the dealership. So we're going to use his journey through the motor retail business to kind of paint a picture of where it's been, where it is now, and then maybe at the end discuss where we think it could potentially go in the future. Yeah, looking forward to this discussion. So I think to get started, maybe if you could just at a high level paint us a bit of a picture of how you got into the motor trade, where you started, and what were those initial years like before you moved into Dealers Online?
Okay, that's a long time ago, so I have to go back in my memory myself. I started in the motor trade in 1992. I worked for a group, but specifically a family-owned, at that stage, Toyota dealer group, in used cars, which was interesting times. Toyota's been then and now was one of the top sellers. So we had the market, but we sold anything. It didn't have to only be Toyotas. And we bought anything, so it was always searching for stock, always trying to get vehicles from all over the place. No different to where it is now. We sold a lot of car rental, fleet, and obviously, as Toyota is one of the commercial top vehicles. So in those days, even we were doing that.
So obviously, the start is always memorable, but maybe if you could just point out like two or three of the big sort of milestones in your career before starting Dealers Online.
As a dealer, you're always looking for stock and wanting to sell stock that you don't want to retail. So I think, coming out of a Toyota dealership and always looking for stock and looking at the right price and looking at it from the right environments. Before Dealers Online, we didn't have that opportunity. So we had to go and cold call to all the car rental places and say, have you got any stock? They'd send you a fax in those days and they'd say, this is what we've got to sell and this is what we're trying to get, make us an offer. And the more you buy, the less the price. So there wasn't anywhere you could log on and go and buy vehicles. You just had to have relationships and hopefully good relationships, otherwise you wouldn't get the stock. Somebody else would get it before you. And it also was in those days we talk about checkbooks. If your checkbook was big and you could buy a lot of stock, you'd get it at the right price. You couldn't buy ones and twos, and you had to take a parcel. It wasn't you could just buy all the white cars. You had to take the red ones and the yellow ones and everything else that went with it, because they were trying to get rid of vehicles. So I think that in all these years, that's kind of where Dealers Online came from. I wanted to try and make it easier for people to source stock and not necessarily have to have relationships with every single one of them.
So I think there's two things I picked up on there. It's I suppose the amount of work involved in like sourcing stock. It wasn't as simple as to logging onto one place. But also the other aspect, which is maybe underappreciated, maybe the relationships and the trust that was formed by doing business, with the same people over a period of time. So I think just looking back at your career, starting off in Toyota in 1992, the year I was born, moving to Audi and then into Sandown, you always were in used cars. So I just wanted to understand, what was it about used cars that, I don't know, kept you in the game? And then what was the dynamics like, through the different sets of experience that you got at the different brands between used and new?
So, I don't know if I accidentally landed up in used cars, but for me it's not so much about the cars, but more the people. And I think when you're selling a new car, it is more of taking an order. It's an order taker. And that wasn't really for me. So it's dealing with people and finding them the right fit for them. And I think that's what was more exciting for me, and actually finding them the right vehicle for their purpose. So that's what excited me at the time. And then, Toyota itself, obviously a volume brand, there's a lot of activity. So when I left Toyota to go to Audi, which was, I wouldn't say a new entrant, but there wasn't a big volume player. So I had to try and create volume in a dealership that was doing 15 to 20 vehicles a month. So that was exciting for me because it was the brand was fighting up against BMW at that stage and Mercedes-Benz for that segment. So to get that dealership to 50 units a month was exciting for me, and everyone that I knew or saw was driving an Audi afterwards. But that was good. And then, my move to Mercedes-Benz was a difficult move for me, to be honest, because I was so passionate about the Audi brand, and when you're selling something you love and care for, to move to the opposition was difficult, but it was also, more of a volume player at that stage. So I had to look at why I did that. I did that more for my family to look at, revenues for myself. And I enjoyed it, but it was a massive opportunity, but it also came with massive stresses because we needed to do volumes of 100 vehicles a month in that outlet. So 100 vehicles a month, 14 salespeople, it comes with its own journeys. And that's actually where Dealers Line was born, because, that is, you're getting so much volume, so many trade-ins. You're talking to all these traders looking for stock. And that's when we decided, let's put this thing online. Let's give them the opportunity to actually look at what we've got to sell without having to have the conversations.
So I think it's interesting. I mean, the comment you made there was more about the people than about the cars. And I think that's something that's very true of used cars, because, people typically always buy from people. So I think looking at what was your recipe in terms of sales, and what made you a successful salesman, particularly in used cars?
That's a good question. But I think, it's always look at, would you sell this vehicle to your mother? I think it's always stuck with me, and it sounds funny, but you have to be completely honest. And if the vehicle doesn't suit them, don't sell it to them, because you're going to always have them come back and say, but you should have told me. Now, because there's a massive financial loss if you decide to bring the car back after a week or two because it doesn't suit your lifestyle. So, I mean, if you ask the right questions, you get the answers, you can actually put them in a car that you think is right. And remember, if you're selling used cars, it doesn't necessarily only one franchise. It's across the board. So you're getting trade-ins from a Land Rover to a Fiat. You must find the right vehicle for that person.
There's two very interesting questions there, because I think with used cars, you've got to obviously find the vehicle, and you've got to find the right vehicle for the customer, which means that you also have to find the customer.
Yes.
So we've obviously seen that that's dramatically changed in, obviously with the internet and the different platforms that we have available now to go about looking for vehicles. And as a consumer, I mean, there's Cars and AutoTrader, there's Gumtree and Facebook Marketplace, and there's a seemingly never-ending supply of classified listing aggregators. So it's very easy to get vehicles out there. But I think with used vehicles, that's not really the problem, because it sounds like one of the major challenges is actually finding the right vehicle for the person, but also building the trust to get them to buy a vehicle from you. So
I think that's more important, to be honest, is the trustedness behind any used car. I mean, we've got such a bad stigma out there about used car dealers. Is to find one that you trust and feel comfortable with. You might pay a little bit more even, but at least you're not going to have a problem.
I think that kind of really brings us to quite a big difference between used and new, where every new vehicle is the same, but every used vehicle is unique. It's one of one, and its previous life and the way it was used shaped the condition it's in specifically, and that's what makes it one of a kind. So I think with new cars, it seems like the majority of the customer knows what they're buying because it's new. They lean on the OEM brand. But in used cars, you don't have that same luxury, so to speak, which makes it a completely different kind of sale. So could you maybe just chat a little bit about the differences between the kinds of salespeople in used and new departments?
Yeah, so I mean, that's the biggest competitors you'll ever get is used and new. So, I mean, the customer comes in and he's looking either for a very good used vehicle with low mileage, well kept, good condition, or he's just going to buy a new car and he knows that he's getting a new car with a warranty, never been driven, comfortable. So it's a bigger job for the used car guy to actually sell a vehicle to the customer. So, to prove to him that you're getting it at a good rate, especially if you're doing a finance deal. I mean, sometimes it used to be less than 300 Rand difference between a new and a used car on a payment. So what are you actually doing? So you have to convince him that he's better off because of the depreciation to buy the used car. Or he's just going to take the new car and then he's going to, with his eyes closed. So it's to find the right stock, you've got to be able to merchandise it properly, make sure that it looks like a new car or close to, so the customer gets the same feeling on that vehicle.
But I think that's really interesting there, because you're starting to get down to like the activity level of like operationally the difference between used and new, because there's a whole set of activities in the dealership which are, required to be able to take a used vehicle, and to get it into where it looks like new, feels like new, smells like new. So I think in terms of the challenges then, I mean, you've got reconditioning and managing that entire process. So could you chat particularly about like some of the way in which you handled that? Because I know there were some games that you became good at. You sold the car before it even...
Yeah, as a used car salesman, you needed to know what vehicles were coming in. From even your fellow salesmen that are fighting the battles with you. So if you knew what the trade-ins were, you could start selling them before they actually hit the ground. But remember, you're taking the vehicle, when it comes in, it's either going to go to the trade or it's going to be retailed again, depending on the condition. So, I mean, it goes through there's a lot of people say 180-point check, 360-point check. It goes to the workshop. You see what you need to spend on it. Is it worth spending the money, or should you just trade it? Because you want to get it to a degree that you're comfortable selling it as a used car in your environment. And I worked for franchise dealers. You're selling it under not only your brand but the OEM brand. The vehicle must be to a certain quality before you can actually sell it, and you want to do that.
And maybe just like back then, I mean, I'm making it sound like it's years ago. It's not too long, but I mean, sure. What were the major sources of stock for your used car floor?
So, I mean, trade-ins is most. So you had to look after your client, and then he'd come back and he'd want something newer. So, I mean, talking to your customers on a regular basis, looking at the workshop when the vehicle comes in for service, chatting to them in the driveway and saying, look, it might be time for you to buy a new car as a joke, but say to him, well, he'd say, well, what will it cost me? What do I have to pay in? Every time you see a car that comes in as a trade-in, you remember, or you go through, and believe me, we used to have a little deck of cars that goes like this. There's no going onto the internet to find the client and what he had bought before. You had to go back in your records and say, I remember he bought, this is a 2007, okay, his mileage must be X. Okay, let's put him in a 2010 now. So it was all manual. There was no CRMs or anything like that. It was you kept your own little book in your diary, and you made sure you spoke to your clients.
It's interesting. So what portion of like maybe it differed from salesman to salesman, I suppose, but in terms of like the stock, like what portion of the stock on the floor came from trade-ins versus buy-ins and auctions and other sources?
So when you're selling new cars as a franchise dealer, you do get a lot of trade-ins. And that's one of the strengths of having a brand. So yes, you get a lot of trade-ins on new as well as on the used, but you still have to go out and buy from car rental and other sources to make sure you've got enough stock for your floor, because you don't have enough demos that are coming through specifically. And when you've got a volume brand, and like I said, I was at Toyota, there was a lot of car rental that Toyota had, and we'd make sure we were there to buy it.
So you got your demo units, which are obviously depreciated from the new car floor. You had the car rental. if you're part of a big dealer group, I mean, some of that stuff flowed onto your floors naturally anyway.
Yeah.
You got your trade-in. Typically, the majority of the trade-ins came from customers buying new cars.
New and used.
New and used.
Obviously, depending, and we had more than one tier of used cars. You'd have the newer 1-year-old, 2-year-olds, and then you'd have a proper used car, which is 5 years and more. We didn't sell a lot to the trade, to be honest. We tried to retail as much as we could.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because I mean, yeah, that's changed fundamentally. I mean, We Buy Cars' entire business was actually built by like pulling that part out of the dealership because that's how you sold the used cars. You went to a dealership.
Yeah.
So I think maybe could you just comment on like some of the effects you've seen from what We Buy Cars has done to the market and how it's changed the game?
Well, I think what it's actually done is given the consumer more options. So, when he had a relationship with a dealer group or where he serviced the vehicle, he had comfort, but he would go in, he would get a trade-in price, he'd do the deal. He wouldn't test the market. He wouldn't know if he was getting the right price for the vehicle. So he couldn't compare it with anything else unless he went to another brand and then they said, oh, you're driving a Toyota, let me try and get you out of the Toyota into the Mazda. So that was the only comparison. And even in those days, they were using trade and retail. So they had a sort of benchmark of what the trade-in would be. But I think this, with We Buy Cars coming into the market and the consumer knowing that he's got another way of selling his car, let me go and see that I'm getting the right trade-in price. Yeah. So the dealers have to actually look at it and say, well, we have to be sharp on our price that we pay the consumer now, which I suppose is good for the consumer.
Yeah, it gets us to a good point of like pricing, right? Because I suppose like there's not much room for error. You can't rest on your laurels. Well, We Buy Cars took that away because now suddenly, as you say, there's another option. Someone potentially, and they've removed all the friction as well of getting a price. They made it very easy to get a very good competitive offer.
Exactly.
So yeah, I think pricing. How did that like when you first started at Toyota and how you progressed? Like, how did you get good at pricing?
I think it comes down to you have to be very, very aware with what your franchise or your OEMs are doing on new cars. Because if there's any discounts there, and in those days, to give you an idea, the fleet discount on a Toyota was 17.25%. It was ridiculous. So if you take that into account, immediately when you're driving that vehicle out of the showroom, it's 20%. Because if a fleet could buy it at a discount of 17.25%, that means it's going to come into the market again at that price. So we had to be very aware of what the discounts were, because a private individual wouldn't get that. He'd probably get 8%. So if you knew those numbers, you would then at least look at a 1-year-old, 2-year-old, and do the calculation. So you always you start at the top and you go, what can I sell it for? And then, what margin would I like to make, and what is the recondition to get it to onto the floor again. So you know what to pay for it.
Yeah. So there's a buy price, sell price, and somewhere in the middle, you kind of looking, because there's a risk that you're taking on the car.
Absolutely.
Trade and retail back then.
Yeah, it was there. It was there. It was not it was a book.
Yeah.
You had to subscribe to the book, so you got your book. You get a fair idea. I think in those days everyone was bought into it, so they were supplying the data back to TransUnion, and then at least I think it might not be the same right now, but you used that book, and you worked backwards from that book, because the banks bought into the price that said their retail, and they financed according to the book. The insurance insured according to the book. So it sort of governed what you did in the trade.
Yeah, it's very firmly entrenched. And still to this day, the banks determine the equity based on the trade value.
Yeah.
Because I suppose there's a need in the market to have a starting point.
That's the benchmark.
Yeah. But in some ways, We Buy Cars became that benchmark.
They did. 'Cause they threw the book out the window and started paying what they wanted to pay. But I think if you use the analogy, what can I sell it for, and what is my margin? They had a different margin, and they knew what they could sell it for. And remember, they do a lot more wholesaling than they do retail.
Well, I mean, that also ties back to like sources of stock because, that's now also become a source of stock for the dealers.
Absolutely.
So it's hard to imagine that there's that much margin in a used car that an entire business can grow seemingly exponentially in quite a short space of time and make money and then still sell the stock to the dealers and they still make money.
Well, you know what? They've done the job that what we're doing in fleet and bringing the stock to the dealer is what they're doing.
Yeah.
And they're just bringing it from the consumer. So they're doing the dealer's work, but they're also taking the dealer's trade-ins, which is, and giving the consumer the price quickly.
It's interesting because, I mean, there's sometimes, like, as much as people want to buy the car, they can't buy the car because the bank still owns it and the customer actually can't get out of that car without
buying something else.
Yeah.
Because they need the overlines.
Yeah. More so now than ever before. So I think that kind of gets us to like the deal structuring part, and how have you seen that evolve from when you started and through your journey and to now?
I think the consumer's a lot more, he knows now that it's, because I mean, I used to have conversations with people that say, are the vehicles selling for 300,000 Rand? Get me a decent discount, man. But they didn't think that the vehicle actually had a cost price, and then it might only be, the cost might be 260 and selling for 300. So there was only 40,000 Rand margin. They thought that the dealers were making 300,000 Rand on the vehicle, but you've got to buy it from the OEM and then sell it to the retailer. So there's a small margin, and that margin has got smaller and smaller. But yeah, I think to structure a deal right now, you're going to look at what the trade-in's worth, what you need to bring it in at, what is the settlement to the bank on the current deal that he's got. You have to see that if you bring it in at that price, is it actually going to be worth it for you, or you're going to use the profit in the vehicle you're selling them to depreciate the vehicle that you're trading in. So we call it an over allowance, but most of the customers don't see that. They just know you're keen to do a deal, and you're going to give you more than what somebody else might give them.
Yeah, it's quite I don't know. I wouldn't say it's like it is very confusing, I think, to your consumer, right? Because I mean they have no idea what's going on
in the background.
Yeah, but there's a lot of different sort of mechanisms that dealers can use to make something happen, but sometimes that's the only way a deal can happen is to get creative.
But I think that's part of the honesty and the trust that you're building. So if you can talk your customer through what you're doing, because remember, if you have to use some of your profit to sell him another car, that means that he probably could have got the discount on the vehicle if he didn't have a trade-in. So if he knows a little bit more about the deal structure, he understands what he's getting himself into. Because if he does hit the skids in 6 months' time and he goes, okay, I need to get rid of the car, there's a certain amount of that profit that's been added to the trade-in that is going to be problematic to get out of that deal again. But the awareness of, I needed to do this deal to get out of this, because there's a lot of reasons why people buy new cars, and it might be because the trade-in needed tires or mechanical repairs that he couldn't afford. So he'd rather just have a payment than having to take hard money and throwing it at his used car.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of the reasons why they're getting into newer cars purely because they're just want to get out of the problems of the old one.
Yeah.
So I think it is very interesting, the new versus used dynamic, because in some ways they're very different businesses. And then when you combine that with workshop and you combine that with F&I, the dealership is kind of a unique business. I mean, there's essentially 4 businesses in one there. And that kind of gets us to maybe the future. We've seen the manufacturers particularly wanting to take greater degree of control over the customer experience on new vehicles. where there's kind of umbrella, extends over whatever period of time they decide to look after the vehicle for, and going after sort of agency-based business models. But I think that's one of the big things. We've looked at other ownership models, if we want to call them mobility-based models, essentially subscription, leasing, rental, whatever. It's all very similar thing in the background. We've obviously got the issues now with affordability and the games that salespeople have been playing, in structuring and getting creative.
Yeah, longer terms.
I think there's this unbundling of the dealership where potentially you've got the opportunity for those four businesses to go their separate ways. If you looked at a direct-to-consumer model in terms of the F&I and like finance and insurance products, that distribution model was built before the internet existed, right? Because that was the point of purchase, and it's no different to a retailer putting the chocolates next to the aisle. I mean, it's the same concept, and essentially the dealership network built out the distribution for finance and insurance.
Yeah.
But now fundamentally different distribution models exist. We've seen that in the States, like for instance with CarEdge, where they built trust with an audience with sort of independent, informative content on all things to do with car buying, car owning, and then they built their own product on top of that. So potentially it's no secret that the banks want to go direct. So that potentially that F&I office might come out of the dealership and, come and be a sort of virtual, sort of digital centralized function. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, definitely the consumer, as I said, is slightly more intelligent around what people are trying to do. And the banks are definitely making it a lot more attractive to actually do the finance directly with them. But yes, there's always going to be the issue where for every 1,000 Rand the consumer lends, the dealer gets an incentive to give them the finance. So yes, I think, but remember the banks, there's a reason for that, because they're losing some of their clients to other banks because the dealer has a better incentive structure with the other bank. So they've got to look at that and how do they lock them down. It's very similarly to what the OEMs are doing, where they're saying, well, we've got to look after these customers that are driving our brands, because if you're a dealer group or you're selling more than one type of brand, how do I keep my customer in that brand? But yeah, it's the margins for the dealer is under strain. I mean, and that definitely is a problem for them. So at the moment, new cars, you won't be making a lot of money selling a new car, and you need to start looking at where else you could. So there will be a better profitability in used cars, because you can govern what you buy the vehicle for and sell the vehicle for. New cars, you have to stick to what the OEM dictates, what the margins are.
So, I mean, for our clients and customers who are essentially the dealerships and dealership groups, we've got, threats from banks and insurers going direct, and that distribution channel that they currently own coming under pressure and potentially being risked. We've got new cars. Well, obviously, in the immediate short term, there's been an oversupply of new stock, and obviously with the consumer affordability. So there's workshop and there's used cars.
Yeah.
I just don't know a lot about the workshop at all.
So workshop's actually quite a profitable business. I mean, you're selling mostly labor, and then there's obviously a profitability on the actual part that you're selling. So depending on the OEM, you might govern that too, but at least you're selling time and labor. So that's a good big margin. F&I has always been profitable. Used cars, depending on the trader. New cars, it can swing.
With workshop, though, is there not with this right to repair and some of the other legislation, and in some ways there are some unfair practices in that, because it's they set the rate, they set the part, and or set the price of the part, or whatever it is, and that's sometimes excessive. Plus, it's obviously imported in this. I mean, there's a lot of margin in there that is not necessarily valuable to the consumer. So it makes sense then potentially that there's opportunity for other businesses to emerge there. So, I mean, what have you seen in this space particularly?
I definitely think it's going to come a lot quicker, but at this stage, I think when the vehicle is still under the OEM motor plan or warranty, the vehicle tends to go back to the OEM workshop. But there is, there's parts coming in which are not OEM parts, which are coming in from all over the world at a reduced price. And I think the insurance companies are very keen to rather put those parts in some of the vehicles because it's cheaper for them, which makes it cheaper for the consumer eventually on the insurance monthlies. But there's a picture there. But I think right to repair is real, and it's coming, and that's giving opportunity for people that couldn't do it before. And if the OEM allows you to fix it, and if you RMI registered, you can fix it at any workshop. It'll be good for the consumer as well as the dealer, especially with a non-franchise dealer.
I think, we've seen on some of the manufacturers have actually cut, it doesn't come with the vehicle, you have to buy it as an extra add-on. So each piece has been kind of broken off and is now kind of a separate line item. So I think that kind of gets us to used cars, and I think we wanted to focus on that specifically. It seems that that's where there's money to be made. But what does it take to make money in used cars? Particularly because there's a lot of independent players. When we were in Rustenburg the other day, and we were so impressed with a lot of those independent dealers and the merchandising and the effort that you can see that they've put into the presentation of their dealership, a lot of pride in that. And that signals to the customer that, if they're putting that effort into how they present the vehicle, and, they're confident in that vehicle's condition. So what does a group need to be good at? Because it's harder to compete against you guys who are worrying about a floor of 20, 30 vehicles. One trader, smart trader, operator. But it seems that the groups are the ones who are under the biggest threat, yeah.
So I think used cars and new cars are always going to compete. So, with the finance schemes that are out there, you sometimes, you buy a new car because it's actually just makes more sense. But I think it's going to come down to pricing, and you have to stand out as a used car dealer. So you said it now, merchandising. The cars must look as close to new and well prepared with their 180-point checks, and make it visible for the consumer. Just to know that there's no risk claim. Have the warranties available. Make sure you pay the right price for the car so you can make a margin, and then you can look after the consumer. Because he's going to come back to you. He's buying it from you because you're a good dealer out there. He's not just buying it from the corner shop. And he's coming to you because he knows he's got the CPA looking after him. He's got a warranty. He feels comfortable, and you've got to make him feel comfortable.
So there's almost like a segment of a certain profile of vehicle that suits the sort of franchise group dealer, where there's certain protections that come with buying the brand from the brand.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting because I think that speaks to how accurate and precise dealers need to get with their profile of their stock. So sourcing the right vehicles at the right price becomes very important, because they need to know what vehicles are profitable for them.
Well, I think the key, and that's where it comes to when the vehicle comes in. Is it a trade unit or is it a retail unit? Now they'll look at the unit and they'll say, okay, it's going to cost me X, Y, and Z to get it to the floor condition to replace or to sell it retail. If it's going to cost me 40,000 rand to repair, firstly it's going to take time, and it's too much money to outlay for repairs as such. So they're going to look for good, clean stock, and they're going to rather spend the right money reconditioning them and then putting them on the floor. But if you're taking real trade stock and you're bringing them back from the dead as such to put on the floor, it doesn't make sense for especially a franchise dealer. He wants 1, 2, 3-year-old vehicles with lower than 100,000 Ks it fits the OEM used car policy. Those are the vehicles that go on those type of floors.
Okay, so we're talking about the different business models. Selling used cars was a lot of the time about like repeat relationships, and also I suppose referrals. You know, where you build so much trust in a relationship multiple times that you become someone's go-to, car guy.
Yeah.
And I know that was, what made you successful, and your model. But in order to do that, you have to stay in one place long enough.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think that's a very big thing. Today, it's a lot easier for the consumer to buy a vehicle anywhere in the country. In those days, he'd go to the place closest to him and only look at the cars in his region, because he didn't really have an opportunity to go. If I'm in Cape Town, I'm not going to buy a car in Joburg. And he didn't know about the car in Joburg, because he would have to buy, which in those days was an auto trader, was a pack like this, and you'd go through it like this, looking for a car. So there was no, I'm looking for a Toyota Fortuner, there's all the Fortuners.
Yeah.
It was going through every ad, and that, I'd rather just go to the local dealer.
And he can go through the ads for me. But I mean, that's...
Which we did.
The interesting thing is, like, We Buy Cars position themselves as the car supermarket. And they've got amazing selection of stock. But they really struggle to sell vehicles over 300,000 Rand. And they've never had salespeople. They've never wanted to, adopt that model. So something to be said about, like, okay, you can have the stock, but can you sell the vehicles?
Well, it comes down to what we chatted about earlier, is about, are you going to go and buy an X5 for 800,000 Rand from a dealer that doesn't actually sell them new? So I'd rather go to a BMW dealer and buy that vehicle, because I know then it's been through the system. Especially, you're buying a vehicle with motor plan, and it needs to actually tick all the boxes to go through the quality control of the OEM. So I feel more comfortable as a consumer buying a vehicle there at that value, and at least I know that if there's any issues, I can take it back and they'll sort it out for me.
So, just a bit of a flashback. When looking at your leads, were they all walk-ins? Referrals network, like, let's just say Auto Trader was always a thing, but it was a book. But, like, when was it exactly that, like, Cars and Auto Trader went digital? And was that still in your time? Or was that...
No, it was definitely in my time. I mean, it's a long time. So yes, definitely a lot of walk-ins. But as I said to you before, you worked in a community. So if you sold a certain brand, people used to come to that brand, and there wasn't as many dealerships as there are now. So you kind of, if you were a Toyota dealer, you kind of owned that region, and you owned the clients in that region. But you used to work at the workshops. I mean, it took me a while. I mean, I was with Toyota for 10 years. So for 10 years, I kind of looked after a certain sort of community on those vehicles. And if you did a good job, then you got referred to their friends and their friends and their friends, and then they came back to you. So in 10 years, you could sell, I probably sold the same person three cars. But you just make sure you look after them, and then they look after you.
And I think they still come to you.
Oh, they do.
So I think it's very interesting there, because it's I don't know if it's reminiscent of a time that is gone, or whether it still exists now. I mean, have you seen it in?
Look, it's much more competitive out there for the dealers now, especially because it's so easy to find a vehicle online and compare. In those days, you went to the dealer, you got a deal, and you trusted him, so you bought the car. Now you can compare deals over the net. I wish it was more like it was then, where a consumer would come back to you because you looked after them. But if you look at salespeople in general, it's difficult for them to make money at the moment, so they move around a lot. They don't, stay at a brand and then look after the client and see them coming back after 3-4 years. And with the finance deals at the moment, you can put a guy into a car and you might not see him for 72 months.
You might never see him again.
So it's very difficult to do what we used to do then.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's definitely it's like that's one of the big things that's changed. It's just like the buying cycles are dramatically longer. So there's longer buying cycles. So customers out of the market for a longer period of time. You've got more competition. The consumers got more information at their fingertips.
Yeah.
But
More options.
But I'd argue like more options is not always the best thing because
No.
it actually becomes harder to make a choice.
It's confusing.
Yeah.
But that's why you've got to be so much better when you're merchandising a vehicle and have the information. So remember, they've got more information about the car than you do because they've got access to the net.
But I mean, if you imagine now a consumer goes into the market and he's now with like the lower cost sort of Chinese brands that are coming with an exceptional product at a really good price.
And the longest service plans.
Yeah. I mean, sure, who knows that they'll be around in business. But I mean, the consumers' options were, if they were looking at used, do I go for like a Tiguan or now do I go with a new H6, a used Tiguan? So it's like the decisions are different because now suddenly there's new cars playing in a space that you would have previously only considered used cars, and it's feature for feature.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a completely different game now as well because I mean, it sounds like that those brands have been very aggressive in entering the market and have put a lot into the vehicles and essentially there's no they just put a lot of vehicles into the market.
No, I mean, you look at Chery, who sold 20,000 vehicles in 18 months.
Yeah.
I think that's the biggest number for early or entry into the market. I mean, it's better than what Aval did.
I mean, I think a lot of those will be, maybe first-time car buyers, potentially maybe people downgrading, as in, taking a step down on the repayment,
But I can also say some of the German brands have lost clients because, it's just become unaffordable for them to buy what they were driving in a new vehicle. And the Chinese have come in and they've come in at a price to grab land.
The exchange rate doesn't help, and I don't think will ever help us.
No.
Yeah. So I think, that comes down to the fact that, when you now need to look after the car, it's outside of its sort of warranty, its motor plan. I suppose if you're playing in that area, like you're going to be the one who owns the car when it's no longer protected. Like I think that's a pretty scary thing for a consumer these days. But how did you handle those types of conversations in the used cars? Because I mean, in the back of their minds, that was a...
Yeah, so it was, the decision is, should I buy a new car or should I extend my existing service plan or warranty? It wasn't such a thing then, but it is now because there's a lot of options even there. Service plan wasn't a thing. It was either motor plan or warranty. So now, you've got a lot more options and at different prices. So the guy's got to weigh it up and say, if I pay an extra 50 grand for another 2 years, is it worth my while? Is it going to add value to the vehicle? Probably not, but it's going to give me that comfort that nothing's going to break in the next 2 years.
But we know like how much margin there is in those products as well.
Well, that's one of the problems, I suppose, because, and you might not be making margins on the vehicle, but there's a good margin in the insurance policies. And, that's what the dealer's driving is to, it's obviously a different value to a vehicle, but it's considerably more percentage-wise profit than it is in a car.
I think what's quite interesting is like used cars were always seen as an enabler of new cars. Particularly that was kind of like the mindset, and I know that was a big thing that drove dealers online initially in the early days. It was like, let's remove the friction in the customers' like car selling process, help the dealership price the car and get rid of that car and turn it into cash quicker so they can reinvest it in retailable inventory. But it was never maybe as attractive like as a profit center. It was there as a out of necessity rather than anything else. And potentially, I mean, you could upsell the guy into a new car if you got him to the used car lot for a demo. You could potentially say, listen, it's not too far away here. Might as well go for the new. But as the market matured, more competitors entered, the internet aggregated everything. Suddenly now you're not just competing against the other dealer in your area, but you're competing against every other dealer across the country.
Yeah, massive.
The consumers picking, just essentially holding a reverse auction themselves, throwing quotes at, can you beat, can you beat, can you beat?
Yeah, and I think that's probably one of the reasons why we've seen the shift to agency model, because then the OEM will give the dealer the margin to deliver the vehicle, but he's not going to see the full margin, and then they can control that.
But you're looking at the cost of like the capital investment, the salaries. It's an expensive venture.
No, it is.
You need to make a lot of money. I mean, like I think you remember what you needed to make every month just to cover the lights and the rent.
No, absolutely. When I took over the Kunenburg showroom, I mean, we needed 1.2 million rent and then staff. So I needed 2 million rand before we opened the door.
Yeah.
And those were in those days.
Every month and it starts again.
So then you have to look at how many vehicles do you need to sell and with what margins and, just to work out. Luckily, as I said, workshop is quite profitable, but you still need to get the volumes through the workshop to make it profitable.
I think one of the major challenges for like a dealer group looking at that is that they've made massive investments into property and infrastructure and, and these franchise agreements and meeting, those obligations. It's quite crazy that, some of these brands, we were talking to one of the dealers that they spend, is like, do you know what that light costs?
No, and it has to be that light and it has to come from Germany. Yeah. Otherwise, you can't have a locally produced one because it's got to all look the same across the world.
And it's crazy to think that conversation going on within the context of some of the conversations that are happening at homes in South Africans' lives. Like the OEM only you need to have that light because that's our brand. But does that matter to the customer? I mean,
he's just it comes down to just walking to a place and say they've spent money here. They're going to look after me. But yes, does it matter that the chair is in a certain color leather and it costs 30,000 rand for a chair? No, probably not. So,
but that little piece is on every single car. But the customer obviously doesn't see that; they just see the price. So I think it's interesting because it sounds like a lot of the core skill sets of like the entrepreneurial trader, that thrived on that used car floor, where they're like a business of one. Sounds like that's a rare breed nowadays.
Completely. There's very little traders left in the market because, firstly, money is expensive, so there's floor plans, there's a lot of things that are governing the used car guys to be careful what they're paying for the vehicle. So yeah, it's if you're part of a group, there'll be a group general used car manager that will dictate certain rules and regulations to them, and that need to use pricing tools that were signed off by the group. As you can't just use trade and retail today. You need to know what the market's what's happening in the market.
But it sounds like the biggest asset for a used car dealership is the quality of its people.
Absolutely.
But
keeping those people, because as I said earlier, it's the repeat business. It's the looking after the customer, because that's worth more than spending millions a month advertising on the classifieds. It's keeping your clients that you've already sold vehicles to, and letting them come back, and feeling that their deal that they got the last time was good enough for them to come and buy another vehicle from you.
It's like as businesses become more corporatized and larger, like the leadership at the top really are just effectively mostly orientated around like capital allocation. So it's hard to go and justify that kind of spend on people when the industry has been notoriously poor at being able to develop and train and its people and maintain them and keep them and retain them and keep them motivated and incentivized.
But I think the biggest opportunity is to have a system in place where you can know your customer properly, know the needs, know where they are in their life cycle, meaning age, kids, knowing what their needs are, but being able to have that in a system where you can market to them when the vehicle comes into the system. So I mean, today I think the biggest opportunity is to have a proper CRM with the right data, so you can actually market to your actual clients that have bought from you before, not necessarily clients that you need to go and advertise on classifieds and get them back into your system.
It sounds like also with new cars, you can put together a promotion, you sell the price, like you advertise one and you've got 50 in stock, it's like,
yeah.
So, but you need to advertise each used car.
Well, they're all different, so you have to.
And I mean, that's work in itself. So it sounds like from, to be successful at used cars, there's this aspect of like choice selection and call it like the customer fit, the customer market fit. So essentially that's just putting the right cars on your floor.
Well, you're not going to have a whole lot of commercial vehicles in your dealership incentive. You're going to look at demographics and see what the needs are in a certain area, and you're going to have that kind of stock.
So as a core skill, it's being able to find the right cars for your dealership floor and to be able to get them at the right price.
Yeah, and sell them at the right price, which is competitive towards what a new one would cost them, especially because there's not a lot of people buying cash deals now unless they're taking it out of their bonds. They're looking at what's it going to cost me monthly, and if it's only a few hundred rands more to buy a new car, then you're going to buy a new car, which has got a full plan, 5 years, maybe 100. Some of the Chinese brands have got much longer.
A million. So that's I think one of the first pillars is just around getting the right cars on your floor. The next thing is about getting the right people in the business, and I think the defining characteristic there would be having an ownership mindset, with some entrepreneurial kind of commercial skill sets, being able to buy and sell and build the deal and understand what's in it there, but also then have the softer skills, personable, can build trust quickly, have got relationships, tend to kind of be in it for the long run, playing the long game. Sometimes that means you have to sacrifice something in the short term for the opportunity over the long term.
Well, that's absolutely. I mean, if you're talking about salespeople, I mean, depending on where they've been and if they haven't been with the franchise for a long time, is for them to rather say, I don't know, let me go and find out, than say something that might deter the guy from really believing in what you're saying. Because you just need to say one thing wrong and then you lose the consumer. He'll just say, well, he doesn't know what he's talking about. But if you go, so I mean, for me, I've always said that it would be fantastic if you could have a salesperson that can be an F&I as well. You can talk on the business side as well as the vehicle side, and combine the two, you will have a strong person instead of just somebody just says what the customer wants to hear, and that's unfortunately what we have a lot of at the moment, because it's not easy to get good quality salespeople at the moment.
I think it's very interesting there where unexpected answer or telling them what not, that's usually the best way of being able to signal trust. So I think that's definitely something that is maybe an area of concern and probably something that needs to be paid the most close attention to. And then the last little pillar I've got here is just tools and data. And most of that orientated around call it customer intelligence. Being able to, have a history and knowledge and understanding. But I think what becomes really important here for a dealership group is that key person risk. So yes, it's great that you got good people who can build relationships, but there's always the risk that they move on. How do you remove that risk and translate some of that knowledge and understanding to a system that can, become a resource or an asset to an organization? I think that's a big challenge. Dealerships have been notoriously, or let's say they've found it very difficult, because a lot of that has to do with discipline, a lot of it has to do with process, but also then it's also about having the right tools for the job.
Well, a salesperson normally isn't a great administrator if he's a good salesman. Yeah. So to get the combination of the two, but making the systems that they use internally in the business user friendly, easy to capture clients, easy to talk them through their needs analysis and actually getting to know them. And then they might not want, or you can't do a deal with them this week, but future you've got them in the system, you could look at them again. But having enough data to know that this is a good time for the guy to actually buy a vehicle, because you have an understanding of where he currently is with his deal, and you can say, okay, well, in 6 months' time, I'll phone you because I'll be able to get you out of that vehicle and get you into a new one quite easily.
And I think what's quite interesting here is like you actually have to keep track of quite a lot of moving parts over a long period of time.
Oh yes, that's the only way you're going to keep your clients.
Yeah, I mean, it's so much about timing. It's like you just got to, you got to make sure you stay relevant and that you've got something meaningful to say at the right time. And I think that's something that becomes, quite interesting where dealership groups have a network. They don't have, their salespeople aren't like, they can sell the group stock. It's actually got a decentralized warehouse spread across the country. But I think that's maybe like a massive opportunity for them.
It's definitely a strength for a group because customer might walk in here and there's a vehicle that he likes at one of his other branches. If you've got an independent dealer who's only got his 60 cars on the floor, he has to phone up another dealer and say, please, can you sell me that? And if it's a good vehicle that he can retail, he's not going to sell it to the trade. So in a group, there's aging policies. You'll be able to pull that car from the other branch and offer it to your client.
So I think for a dealership group, it's like I think there's some political and organizational dynamics that they need to overcome. But it's definitely like in this landscape when customers are inquiring on a car, it might not be that car, but you can potentially find it from within the network. So you can solve two problems. You can potentially alleviate someone's aging issue over there, but you can also obviously create a customer over here.
Yeah.
So you kill two birds with one stone. But that all comes down to communication and collaboration across the network.
Access to the information. I mean, it's easy to pull a stock sheet for the whole group instead of just your own branch.
So I think, this sounds like that with used cars particularly, it's a big focus needs to be placed on this because in the coming months and years that this is definitely going to be something that's going to be more and more important to not just like the survival of the dealership, but also them being able to thrive.
Well, I think that's where your strength can be because the power is in your hands to actually pay the right price and sell it for the right price. So you can govern the margins yourself. Where with new cars, you can't.
I think there's so many things that are outside of your control in that space. And again, that's what makes motor retail so interesting. Finance, insurance, manufacturing, and retail.
It touches on many different areas.
Yeah, there's obviously the labor and parts in the workshop. So it really is like a very dynamic and multifaceted business. And it's going to be interesting to see where it goes in the future. But I think for us, the message is around used cars.
Go used cars.
Okay. So that discussion brings us to the end of our second installment of CarFling Asks. But I think hopefully there is some interesting insight in there, particularly around opportunity in used cars. And I think, there's a lot of work to be done and a lot of opportunity. And I think it's something that we spent an awful lot of time thinking and talking about, probably more so than anyone else. So if you want to think and talk to us about anything that we've discussed here, particularly around any of the tools or data that you might need in order to be able to support your used car strategies, please get in touch.